Welcome to the debate, Cult Psychology, the Blueprint of Twisted Devotion. Today we analyze the ideas from the book The Unseen Cult. I'm your host, representing the Skeptics Chair, where we question whether a book or any intellectual framework really can truly armor you against the darkest parts of human nature.
And I'm joining you from, well, the other side of the aisle. I'm looking at this material not just as a cautionary tale, but as a necessary toolkit for modern survival. The central premise we're tackling today, the one Angel Gabriel lays out, is that cults are not random anomalies. They're not accidents. They are sophisticated machines. They are, at their core, engineering problems. They exploit what's being called the empty space, our universal human needs for belonging, for purpose, and for identity.
Protecting your own autonomy in an era of, frankly, industrial-scale manipulation. But my hesitation starts right there, at the foundation. While the threats described here are undeniably real, terrifyingly so, I have to question the practicality of the prevention strategies proposed. We're talking about psychological predators who use sleep deprivation, starvation, intense social pressure to break people. Are we really suggesting that a checklist or a resilience roadmap is going to hold up against that kind of artillery? It feels a bit like bringing a knife to a drone strike.
See, I see it differently. I think the logic here is transformational because it demystifies the monster. If you understand the framework of unseen chains and how resilient works, you aren't just bringing a knife, you're dismantling the drone before it even takes off. This is about immunizing yourself against deception by understanding the blueprint. If you know how the machine works, you can see the gears turning long before you get caught in them. It shifts the power dynamic from this mystical fear to a structural analysis.
Okay, let's test that theory. I want to start with that opening concept, the empty space. So the argument is that cults target these very specific vulnerabilities: loneliness, transition, trauma, the search for purpose. My issue is just the universality of this. Who isn't lonely? Who hasn't gone through a breakup or a job loss or a death in the family? The text mentions significant life transition and profound loneliness as these key vectors for infection. If everyone experiences these voids, isn't this warning system just too broad to be useful? If I'm grieving the loss of a parent, I am vulnerable. That's a biological fact. But does knowing that actually help me diagnose Machiavellian cunning in some charismatic leader offering me comfort?
It's not just about knowing you are vulnerable. It's about recognizing the specificity of the attack that follows. You're right, everyone feels the empty space. But recruitment isn't random. It's a meticulously engineered psychological campaign. The diagnostic precision comes from recognizing the response to your vulnerability. When you're lonely, a normal community offers welcome, a handshake, a coffee, a chat. A cult offers love bombing.
But in the moment, those feel exactly the same. That is the problem. A hug feels like a hug, whether it's from a saint or a sociopath. In fact, the sociopath's hug probably feels better because they've studied exactly what I need.
They feel the same emotionally, sure, but structurally, they're wildly different. And that's what this framework teaches us to see. Love bombing is described as this intense, almost suffocating outpouring of affection designed to mimic unconditional love instantly. It is distinct from genuine connection because it's transactional and it's accelerated, it's efficient, and it's followed immediately by targeted outreach. The argument is, if you understand these mechanisms, you transform that vague feeling of, wow, these people really like me, into a concrete warning sign. Wait, this is too much, too fast. It empowers you to see the hook before you bite. It's about moving from an emotional reaction to an analytical observation.
I'm just not convinced that a person in the throes of grief has the capacity for that kind of analytical observation. When you are drowning, you grab the lifeline. You don't stop to check the manufacturer's label. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, someone misses that initial red flag and gets pulled in. This is where we need to look at the unseen chains, right? The mechanics of retention.
Exactly. And this is the core of the engineering problem. The concept of the unseen chains breaks down why people stay, which is, I think, the most baffling part for outsiders. We see smart, capable people remaining in these terribly abusive structures. The text details the efficiency of isolation and information control. It's not just about locking doors, it's about locking minds. The framework explains that by discrediting all outside sources as satanic or suppressive or simply negative, the cult effectively seals the mind. This validates the victim's experience by defining what it calls no-exit psychology. It's not that they won't leave. It's that their reality has been so thoroughly engineered that leaving feels like spiritual suicide.
Okay, I understand the mechanism, but I want to push back on this slippery slope narrative that's presented here. We have this comparative analysis, healthy community versus cult control, and it contrasts things like collaborative decision-making versus centralized decision-making. On paper, that looks clear. But in reality, the strategies list intense positive attention as a trap. Are we risking making listeners paranoid about any tight-knit group? I mean, if I join a CrossFit gym or a startup or a dedicated volunteer group, there is intense positive attention. There's often a centralized plan or a charismatic founder. Is the line really that clear in the moment?
I think you're conflating enthusiasm with control. The distinction isn't the volume of the noise. It's the information access and individual identity. In your CrossFit gym, if you say, I think I'll skip today and go for a run instead, they might razz you, but they don't threaten you with divine punishment or cut you off from your entire family. The unseen chains rely on the systematic devaluation of the outsider. It's the us versus them mentality, but weaponized. The blueprint explicitly states that in a cult, the old self is disassembled to make room for the group identity. A healthy community celebrates your uniqueness. A cult demands identity fusion.
Okay, but look at the case study of Ilara's erosion. It started with subtle mockery of her old friends. That happens in high school cliques, that happens in corporate offices, where you have to buy into the company culture to get promoted. My fear is that by labeling these universal social pressures as cult mechanics, we might be diluting the definition. And conversely, if someone is in a high-control group that doesn't mock their friends yet, they might think they're safe. The information control framework says they filter perception through the cult's lens. Isn't that what every strong ideology does? Political parties, religious institutions, they all want you to see the world through their framework.
To a degree, yes. Everyone has a lens. But the difference is the no-exit psychology and the physiological enforcement. The text describes a psychological prison constructed of fear and guilt. In a political party, you can switch sides without fearing you will literally lose your soul or be hunted down by former peers. The unseen chains are forged by things like sleep deprivation and repetitive chanting, actual physiological manipulation. The text mentions exhaustion dulls the mind. This isn't just strong persuasion, it's biological sabotage. The framework is essential because it removes the shame from the victim. It explains that they didn't just fall for it, they were systematically broken down by a thought reform process.
I'll grant you the physiological aspect. The sleep deprivation is a hard line that separates a strict tennis club from a dangerous cult. But let's shift to where this control leads. We aren't just talking about people wearing matching robes. We are talking about the transition from belief to crime. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
And this is the most chilling part of the analysis, specifically that section when belief becomes crime. The argument here is that we need to understand how moral compasses get recalibrated. It's not that these are just bad people doing bad things. It's an ideological reframe.
Explain that concept a bit more, because that sounds like a euphemism for brainwashing.
It's more specific than brainwashing. Brainwashing sort of implies a blank slate. Ideological reframe takes your existing values and twists them. The text details how acts that are objectively criminal are subjectively experienced as righteous. Financial exploitation is disguised as sacrifices for the greater good. Sexual abuse is framed as a spiritual union or a test of faith. The argument is that this insight is crucial for identifying fraud early. If someone just asks for your money, you might be suspicious. But if they ask for an investment in eternity to repurpose divine resources and you've already bought into the ideology, your defenses are way down. Understanding this reframe allows you to spot the fraud even when it's dressed up in holy robes.
Here is where I really struggle with the implications. Does the concept of invisible shackles and ideological reframe, does it let perpetrators off the hook? If we say, oh, it was groupthink, their moral compass was recalibrated, are we removing personal agency?
Not at all. It explains the mechanism, it doesn't excuse the act. It helps us understand the why so we can intervene.
But look at the investigator's conundrum mentioned in the later chapters. This is a massive risk. The text admits that victims often articulate willing participation because of the coercion. So if the logic is telling us that victims willingly participate because of this recalibration, does that make legal justice impossible? I worry the book portrays the cult leader's control as so absolute that it just induces hopelessness. If I'm a lawyer looking at this and the witness says, I gave him the money because I wanted to save the world, how do I prosecute fraud? The mens rea, the intent to be defrauded, is muddied by the belief.
That is exactly why this framework is so necessary. The investigator's conundrum highlights the gap between traditional law and psychological reality. The text calls for a specialized, adaptive playbook. It argues that we need to understand the systematic erosion of free will to prove undue influence. By mapping out the slippery slope, how these minor boundary violations escalate to normalization, the book actually provides the roadmap for prosecutors to build a case based on a pattern of manipulation rather than a single incident of consent. It shifts the focus from the victim's yes to the leader's engineered pressure.
It's a nice thought, but in a courtroom, psychological landscape is a very hard thing to prove. The text even mentions that proving intent is difficult when the perpetrator claims religious freedom. The criminal shift section is terrifying because it shows just how effective the insulation is. Suppression of dissent morphs into violence. If the analysis is right and the groupthink reinforcement is this strong, then the individual is effectively erased. My challenge is this. The book offers this analysis to the average reader. But is its information useful for prevention, or is it just a terrified look at how helpless we are against a sociopath?
It's useful because it breaks the spell of the divine. When you see that Manson's helter-skelter or a leader's sexual rights or just cognitive dissonance reduction and moral disengagement techniques, they lose their mystical power. The book strips the architect of deception of their magic and reveals them as a con artist using a specific script. That revelation is the defense. It turns a monster into a mechanic.
Which brings us to the solution. The book proposes a resilience roadmap. You called it a toolkit earlier. I want to drill down into what that actually looks like in practice, because I have some serious doubts about its efficacy under pressure.
Yes, and I find this to be the most practical section. It moves beyond theory. The prescription of critical thinking, healthy skepticism, and diversifying information really does act as a hygiene routine for the mind.
Hygiene routine? That sounds nice, like brushing your teeth. But the text suggests a personal audit, listing your values independently to proof your identity against identity reconstruction. That sounds like homework.
It's highly efficient homework. If you know what you stand for, your core beliefs, it is much, much harder for someone to overwrite them. The text suggests you list, say, 3 to 5 personal values. If a group demands you violate those, alarm bells ring. It creates a baseline. If you value family and the group says your family is holding you back, you have a direct conflict between your audit and their reality. That conflict is your safety valve.
But earlier, we talked about the tactical brutality, sleep deprivation, exhaustion, starvation. If I am being starved and kept awake for 48 hours, I don't care about my personal audit. I care about sleep, I care about food. The book describes the aftermath, the scars that remain, as a lifelong odyssey of PTSD and identity confusion. If the damage is that severe, is the advice to journal or seek diverse news actually strong enough? I feel like the individual toolkit is being pitted against a systemic weapon. It places the whole burden of defense on the individual who is being systematically dismantled.
You are focusing on the gauntlet of escape, which is the worst-case scenario. The resilience roadmap is about prevention. It's about catching it before the sleep deprivation starts.
The personal vulnerability check-in asks, have you experienced a transition? Are you lonely? If you answer yes, the book tells you to actively seek out new, diverse communities. It gives you an action plan so you don't walk into the trap in the first place. It's about recognizing that you are, psychologically speaking, immune compromised, and so you need to avoid the contagion.
And if you are already in the trap, what then?
Even then, the Gauntlet of Escape chapter outlines the phases: cognitive dissonance, pre-contemplation. It validates that little spark of doubt. It says that doubt you're feeling, that's not a sin, that's your exit. It highlights the importance of external intervention, a family member refusing to give up. The book doesn't say do it alone. It emphasizes strong social support as a pillar of prevention.
I'll give you that the social support aspect is theoretically strong. But the text also admits that cults sever those ties immediately. Isolation from outside information is step one. So if the prevention relies on a support network that the cult forces you to cut off, we have a circular problem. You need the network to see the cult, but the cult removes the network.
But that is the red flag. That's the point. The moment a group asks you to cut off your support network, the book's training kicks in. You recognize the isolation tactic. You recall the comparative analysis where healthy communities encourage outside contact. The book empowers you to draw the line at that specific moment. It's a binary switch. They want me to cut off mom. This is a cult.
Ideally, yes. But the allure of the empty space is powerful. If the cult offers me the love I'm desperate for, I might be willing to cut off my skeptical brother who criticizes me. The emotional hook often overrides the intellectual checklist. I think the book underestimates how much we want to believe the lie. We want the magic. We want the answer to all our problems.
Which is why the critical literacy component is so key. It's not just about emotions. It's about training the brain to recognize logical fallacies. It's about healthy skepticism. The book isn't a magic wand. It's a manual. You have to practice it. You have to build that muscle before the heavy lifting comes. You can't learn to swim when the tsunami hits. You have to learn beforehand.
I suppose that's where we land. It's a manual, but it requires a user who is alert enough to read it and disciplined enough to apply it. And frankly, humans are messy, emotional creatures, not software that can just run a virus scan.
But we can upgrade our software. That's the hope. I think it's a vital manual for modern survival. As we wrap up, I want to reassert that The Unseen Cult is a must-read. We live in a world of information overload and fragmented communities. Recognizing the architects of deception and, more importantly, the empty spaces within ourselves is the only way to prevent these echoes of violence. We have to understand the machinery to stop the production line of victims.
I acknowledge the chilling accuracy of the criminal descriptions. The breakdown of how belief becomes crime is essential reading for anyone, especially in law enforcement or law. However, I maintain my caution. These methods are useful diagnostic tools, but I warn listeners not to underestimate the complexity of breaking free. Prevention is harder than the book implies. It requires more than just a checklist or a journal. It requires a society that doesn't leave people so lonely and vulnerable in the first place.
And perhaps that's the ultimate takeaway. The book asks us to build healthy communities so the cults have no empty spaces left to fill.
We agree that the veil has been lifted. It is now up to you, the listener, to decide if you are currently standing in a healthy community or on the edge of a slippery slope.
Indeed. Stay critical, stay connected.
And stay safe. Thanks for joining the debate.